Well, welcome to this conference, which is organised by the Nottingham Trent University's Post-Colonial Study Centre in partnership with the wonderful Bonington Gallery. It is a great pleasure and honour to welcome Tsitsi Dangarembga and Jennifer Nansubuga Makumbi to this keynote event. I thank you both so much, for agreeing to having this conversation. Both Amy and I have been wanting to have something like this, for a very, very long time. So we are very excited. Just for those who don't know, my name is Nicole Thiara, and I am one of the directors of the Post-Colonial Study Centre. And this is my colleague, Amy Rushton, who will now introduce herself.
Yes, my name's Amy Rushton. I'm Senior Lecturer in Literature at Nottingham Trent University and also a member of Post-Colonial Studies Centre. And as Nicole was saying, we've been planning, we've been planning for a very long time to interview Tsitsi and Jennifer. Originally, probably a few years ago, thinking separately back in the day when we were thinking about bringing people over. And actually, we realised under the circumstances with this conference that not only would we be able to, have kind of access to online, but actually have them in conversation with each other. Because as much as we would love to talk to them and discuss their amazing work with them, we thought, well, actually, they probably have much more kind of interesting things to say to each other, and there are kind of commonalities as well in their kind of respective publishing backgrounds, and also some differences as well. And that was kind of the idea behind having this conversation as a keynote for this conference on patterns of struggle and solidarity, and really bringing, I think for what we think, and I think a lot of people agree with this as well, bringing two of the most exciting writers working in English literature and Anglophone literature today, to bring them together to discuss those patterns of struggle and solidarity across publishing and readership, as we'll get onto there as well. So, okay, that's probably hopefully the most you'll hear me speak, other than when I'm asking you a question in a bit. So I'm going to introduce Tsitsi Dangarembga now, and Nicole will shortly introduce Jennifer. So Tsitsi is a writer and filmmaker, born in then Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. Tsitsi was educated in Britain and Zimbabwe. So her writing career began in theatre, and in 1988, her first novel, Nervous Conditions, was published. Now regarded as a classic, Nervous Conditions is arguably one of the most taught novels across literary studies, and was named by the BBC as one of the top 100 books that have shaped the world in 2018. I know for my part, I think reading it as an undergraduate student, really did change my life. So I'm always very grateful for Nervous Conditions for that. Then in 2006, she actually published The Book of Knots, which is a sequel to Nervous Conditions. And then Tambu's story has continued in 2018 with the release of the wonderful This Mournable Body. And I'll be asking Tsitsi a bit more about that novel very shortly. So over to Nicole.
Lovely. Now, I have the pleasure of introducing Jennifer Nansubuga Makumbi, a writer and friend whom I've known for a long time. I'm a huge fan of her work, and I keep pestering her to write faster, with varying success. So Jennifer is a writer from Uganda who has lived in the UK, or more precisely in Manchester, for over a decade, and most of her work is either set in Uganda, all over Uganda from what I can see, or in Manchester, precisely, if it is set in the UK. She holds a PhD from Lancaster University and is now lecturer in creative writing at Manchester Metropolitan University. Her first novel, Chintu, which won the Kwame Manuscript Project in 2013, was first published by the Kwame Trust in Kenya, 2014, and I have one of those really rare copies, which I kind of treasure very much. And it is now also published by One World, as are all her other works. She's an award-winning short story writer, and most of her short stories are published in the collection Manchester Happened, which came out in 2019, followed in 2020 by this wonderful, the first woman, I do. And the last two, also have different names elsewhere in the world, in case people get confused. Among the many awards that she won is the prestigious Wyndham Campbell Prize for Fiction in 2018. and I'm very much looking forward to asking her a few questions later on. But first, over to Amy and Tsitsi again.
Thank you, Nicole. I was going to say, actually, I forgot. Actually, we agreed to do this, so there you go. all my coffees. So there you go. But I actually realised though, I think they look like they've been republished, I think, or at least they have new cover artwork, I think, in the UK by looks of it. So it popped up earlier, so kind of exciting as well, and will mean I need to get more new copies of them as well. I think I've got multiple copies of all of these in various forms as well. But yeah, so actually the question that I wanted to ask you was actually specifically in relation to This Mournable Body, which is obviously the third and possibly final in the Tambu's story as well. Yeah, something that I find really fascinating about all three novels, but then particularly in the most recent one, is the ways in which Tambu's narrative perspective changes. And I was lucky enough to hear you be interviewed, I think it was a few years ago, while you were actually writing a draft of This Mournable Body, where you actually did talk a little bit about why you were experimenting with a change in the way in which Tambu's story was being told as well. So yeah, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to hear a little bit more about the ways in which, for you, Tambu's narrative perspective and voice changes across the three novels, and particularly in the latest work. And also, I was wondering, is it's really jarring to no longer be hearing from Tambu directly. So for those of you who haven't yet read This Mournable Body, there's a change in narrative perspective from first person to second person. So rather than kind of hearing Tambu, it almost feels like we're kind of the readers embodying her. And I was kind of wondering, what in the process kind of made you decide or kind of feel like that was the right fit for this particular part of Tambu's story, but also kind of I was kind of interested in thinking about it in terms of mental health and mental distress, because there's also something very, as myself, someone who's like chronic depressive, there's something very recognizable about that kind of alienation and depersonalization that we get in This Mournable Body as well. So I thought it was clear enough, but yeah, basically narrative perspective and change, and kind of how it kind of reflects your process and also what's happening with Tambu in this novel.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you for that lovely introduction and for the invitation to the conversation today. It's really exciting to have this conversation. Yes, and thank you for the question about the change of voice in the trilogy. Part of it was intentional and part of it really was circumstantial and necessary. When I wrote Nervous Conditions, I was quite consciously giving Tambudzai this precocious voice as a child. And I hoped it would endear her to people and people would find it funny. And I think some of that hope has been realized, for which I'm very grateful. But that voice was possible with Tambudzai the child because she was looking forward in a hopeful manner. Her actual everyday life was really distressing and orienting, but she had the energy of hope and actually progress through life, starting off in an impoverished village, an impoverished family, and then moving on to a home with her relatives who were wealthier and better off, and then onto a school that she felt would launch her career. This had all changed, of course, by the time we get to This Mournable Body. There had been other changes as well, societal and national changes, in that the country had become independent. And so somehow Tambudzai's story became linked to the trajectory of the country, the hope, the progress, and then independence coming, and people like Tambudzai finding out that their hopes had been completely dashed. And right now in Zimbabwe today, drug addiction is one of the growing problems amongst the youth, simply because of that dashing of hope. Zimbabwe had a highly educated population. Now, with that population, people are not able to sustain themselves. They're really unable to eat. Rather than thinking about 3 meals a day, the average person is grateful if they can get 1 nourishing meal a day. And so that is the situation in which we find Tambudzai as an adult. And this certainly wasn't what she had envisaged. As a child, there was a location of hope in the trajectory that she looked at in the future. Now, as a woman, that trajectory of hope has shrunk. And it looks as though there is absolutely no place to go. It's like it's one big brawl. But having grown up in the way she did, Tambudzai is not really able to embrace that completely and become the kind of person who can function in a unitary or at least a somewhat cohesive manner in that kind of society. Functioning in a cohesive manner in that kind of society really requires deadening and amputating a lot of the things that we consider to be positively human. And so it is this struggle within her that leads to this split, whereas she is almost talking in the novel as to herself and calling herself you. So that is the situation with respect to the character. On the other hand, with respect to myself as a writer, I had also not expected to have to navigate Tambudzai through such a dreadful society. When I came to the end of the trilogy, I had also thought that there was hope and there would be a place for women, and the struggle would be essentially feminist, as in finding a place where women can realize their ambitions and hopes and dreams and contribute to society. And it turned out that that is not the case. Really, the struggle for all but the elites, whether they be political, whether they be business elites, and often they are intertwined anyway. The struggle for people who do not belong to those elites is really about existence. And it's a tragedy for me because I relate to my country. And it was very difficult to find the distance that I needed in the first person, because I'm so tied up with it on a day-to-day basis. You know, as an adult who is an observer of society, there is no way that I can distance myself from these things. And then the third question is, do I want to distance myself? What happens to the tone and the impact of my writing if I do decide that I'm going to distance myself? You know, there's been a lot of satire, or maybe attempts at satirizing the situations in countries like Zimbabwe, not necessarily Zimbabwe itself, but other countries that have gone through similar situations. And I don't know whether those attempts at satire always result in the impact that I like to have. I like to have a kind of impact that is personal and emotional rather than intellectual. You know, because I feel that that is the wellspring of understanding, of action, of trajectory, how you orient yourself to go forward. So those were the 3 things that worked for me to change the voice. The nature of the character, her disappointment, her frustration, but still that core of wanting there to be something better where nothing presented. The writer's choice as to which voice would be useful, and also keep that relationship, intimate relationship with the audience. I realized that if I went into the third person, the distance would be much too great.
Yeah.
And not only for the novel itself, but for being part of a trilogy where the other 2 had been in the first person. So with all those things going on, I experimented with the second person, and I felt this is it. It had that ring, when you know that this is the right thing, then I realized that that was the voice to go with.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. That was easy, and that is a fantastic answer, and just really, yeah, I think it says a lot about thinking about that personal and political, that I think is at the heart of your work. I think, and why it's so beloved by a lot of people, including myself, and I know Jennifer and Nicole as well. Yeah, thank you so much. I have so many questions and follow-up questions for that as well, but I'm sure I know we need to bring Jennifer in as well, but I'm sure Jennifer also probably has things to pick up on from that as well. But yes, thank you.
Yes, well, thank you. Well, Jennifer, I just have sort of a kickstart question before you guys can also, if everyone shape this interview in ever which way you want. But well, I mean, there's so much I love about your writing, Jennifer. And I love talking to you about your writing. I love this fearless and experimental character of your work. I feel like you constantly want to break boundaries. You're almost like writing in some ways to break certain, narrative conventions down. And in that way, your writing always surprises me, even though your characters start feeling like really old friends almost immediately. And there's just so many new character friends that I constantly sort of carry around with me. And I think that there's something about your work that makes me love them almost immediately, even after sometimes a page I really care so deeply. And one of the elements of your latest novel, The First Woman, that I found most remarkable is the way in which you combine oral narrative features with a novelistic form. And because we find Thiara, sort of hovering on the ceiling, she feels, while also trying to really get her cousins to listen to her. And they just don't want to listen to her. And she has this fabulous story that she wants to tell. And this story is woven throughout, the entire text. And I think this combination of sort of seamless merging of oral narrative elements with a novelistic form creates something quite distinct and new. And I think I have a sense that you do that a lot, but always in different ways. Yeah, you do it differently with Chintu, for example, in which sort of a clan curse is woven and shapes the entire narrative. So how do you approach these oral story forms that you want to incorporate in your work? And do you consciously set out to include oral storytelling conventions, or is it something that just happens?
Thank you. Thank you for that question, Nicole. And hi, everyone. Thank you for having me to have this conversation with Tsitsi. I'm really looking forward to having the kind of conversation around our writing and around Africa and reading. Now, with my incorporation of oral traditions, what choices I make, and whether this is conscious. Yes, it is a conscious decision I took when I started writing, that I would always try and incorporate oral traditions. But this is because I was lucky when I did my first degree to have studied African oral traditions as a module of African literature, and therefore was introduced to oral traditions as texts. So we studied myth, we studied legends, we studied the folk tale, and I was quickly aware that my writing, my creativity has its history more in the oral tradition rather than the text that I had been taught in school. I quickly realized that while other people have Savandi and Shakespeare, I have Chintu and I have Nambi, and that is where those are my references when I look for old literature that I can look at, but also I was quickly told that oral traditions, most of those texts are coded, that especially oral folk songs, folk tales, that as a child you look at it, at surface level, but actually when you grow up and start to look at it, it's doing something else. And it was such a pleasure for that course when we started to take texts that we had learned as children and then present them to a class as literary texts to look at. And so it was so natural for me when I started to write to incorporate all of those elements. So it was obvious to me that I would start with Chintu, the first man on earth. So, and indeed, when the book came out, for Ugandans, it wasn't, what is she doing? What is going on? It was like, oh, Chintu. They knew what to expect. It's just that they found out how I interpreted it. And it all made a lot of sense to Ugandans because all of us study these oral traditions as history when we are doing primary school. So for me, I guess the education I had in Uganda and then the literature that I studied all came together when I started to write. Now, yes, in Chintu, it was interpretive, but in the second novel, in The First Woman, I thought, let me take the readers on the journey of interpretation. So let me have the texts themselves in here, and let's look at them, as texts rather than as stories for Chirabo. So, but also, it is important for me to point out that I had a lot of fun doing this, So it wasn't so much as, oh, I must have these texts here. They had to be very relevant, they had to work, but I also had to have fun doing it.
Oh, it shows. It really shows when you read. I mean, there's just so much energy, in all your novels. And The First Woman, I reread it. I had to stop myself from reading it too quickly because I knew that the next book was going to take forever. So I was just kind of trying to pace myself.
Oh, a bit of a passive-aggressive dig there.
I put up with that all the time.
Yeah, so do I.
Well, I just don't write. I live on other people's stories. I need them.
It's true, yeah. We literally are consumers, aren't we? Consumers. Oh dear. Well, actually, I think pace. I think is something that's common with both of you as well. I think it's something that I think might come up, and I'd be interested to know a little bit more about. I know a bit with Jennifer in terms of how it seems like the two novels and the short stories have been arrived quite quickly, but actually there's a much longer story, particularly for Chintu. And also it was easy. I don't know, what I would be interested to know for you as well, from you, is kind of about, the Book of Knots, when that appeared, I think really took people by surprise. I don't think anybody really, particularly in Europe and in North America, I think we really didn't expect, kind of a sequel to Nervous Conditions, and then this mournable body appearing. So the first connection question that we wanted to bring you both together with, it relates to this. So we'd like to invite you to kind of reflect on your experiences from publishing your first novels in comparison to the experience of publishing your most recent work, so This Mournable Body and The First Woman. So it was easy. I'll invite you to go first if you'd like.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. Yes, my experiences publishing and the differences between publishing my first novel and publishing the last in the trilogy, my latest novel, This Mournable Body, that is so interesting, because in terms of my subjective experience, there wasn't a great difference in the journey to publishing. with both of them. I wrote the manuscript, it was in process. I needed people to just read it and tell me whether I was writing sense to begin with, because I had never written anything like that. I had never read anything like that. This was back in the 1980s with the first novel. I was reading the African American women writers at that time, and it was the most engaging and relatable text that I had read, but it was still very different. It was African American with the point of departure being slavery and the aftermath of that. And so I had no reference for what I was doing. So people think, or people have asked me how I deal with writing well. But really, I never feel that I'm writing well. I just feel I want to say something, and I hope I can say it well in a way that is meaningful for people. And so I started sending it out to publishers. This is Nervous Conditions, and it was just turned down. And I actually put it away. I sent it to the women's press eventually, because I had read Alice Walker's The Color Purple, which had been published by the women's press. And I didn't hear back from them. So I thought, okay, that's it. And I had a similar experience with This Mournable Body. I started writing it. I had drafts, sent it out to people who just told me they didn't think it was for them, until I thought, well, this is it. Now, in between, I'd gone to film school. And so I thought my actual career would be in film. And there was another rude awakening there. The industrial issues surrounding film, I think, becoming well known in the public domain now because of the diversity movements coming out of Hollywood. But this was in the mid-90s, and that was another rude awakening. So it dawned on me that I'd better find out how to write things that people actually wanted to read, because that was something I could do with myself and the book if necessary. I didn't even need electricity. I could have a candle. Whereas with film, I needed somebody to trust me with money, real money. And so I went back to my old texts and I started brushing them up, working on This Mournable Body again, still with no success. And eventually, after the Book of Not had been published, I started putting excerpts on social media. And eventually, Ella Wakatama Orfrey, who was a friend on social media at that time, you know how everybody just clicks on everybody. She read an excerpt and asked me to send her the completed manuscript when I had a readable draft. And so really, it was very similar. And then by the time I was able to send her the draft and she was able to read it, time had moved on again. But then she took everything over. She actually acted as my unpaid agent. Today, I have an agent today for the first time, but that is a contractual relationship. Ella did it for me simply because she felt that the book was worthwhile. So the experiences were quite similar, in fact. And yeah, there was a long time between the two books, but it's actually quite surprising that one's literary presence would have so little impact. You know, although you hear that, you know, you hear that your book is taught and it was one of the 100 best African books of the 20th century, and it's this and it's that. But in terms of impact on your actual life, you know, it could have it could have been one of those things that emanate from magic pots that just are suddenly there and people have it and the pot is not so important. So that's how I experienced it. So the difference has actually been in what happened afterwards. Because now with This Mournable Body adding up to the trilogy and the recognition of This Mournable Body, the reception of myself as a writer, of me, the person, has been completely different. And I feel that I can build on that. But that was not the case when I was writing back in the 1980s. And I think this is because of a shift in the world. The world is much more ready to hear, to narrate, to work, to understand stories that may not be completely immediate. There's an understanding that the village is actually a lot smaller than we thought it was, and we have to learn how to get. And so I think that shift in terrain has been very positive. I think I've benefited from the excellent writing that has come out in between from people like Jennifer and women of color who originated from the continent as well. So I think I am now able to move in their wash, as it were. And I find it very useful and very empowering, and I'm so grateful.
Well, thank you so much, Tsitsi. That's not the answer I expected at all. Thank you. How's your journey, Jennifer?
First of all, can I say, Tsitsi, I find that incredibly unbelievable. Because, everybody around the world, everybody I know, everyone talks about the Nervous Conditions as the book. I mean, everybody knows the opening sentence.
The greatest opening sentence of all time, I think.
This is, we all quote you, we all talk about it, and it just does not make sense when the book goes around the world doing its thing, and it's so divorced from the author, And so for me, when I heard that you didn't have an agent, that you didn't, you struggled to find a publisher for your second book, I was like, are they publishing if they're not going to scramble to get Dangarembga's books? It just, I'll put that aside, But
Thank you for articulating that.
My journey was quite different, because I was crazy enough to wrap up all my life in Africa and sell everything I had, pack my bags, and come and study creative writing, believing that I can make a living out of it. And by the time I found out that I would not, it was too late, and I could not go back home, because you just don't go back to Africa from Britain a failure. That was out of the question, So I had to stay in Britain. But I came to study, and I wrote my first novel, which is The First Woman. I completed it. My lecturer told me, oh my God, this is book material. I didn't even know what the book was at the time, because back then we didn't know about awards for, you just wrote and people bought your book. But and then of course it was rejected left, right, and center. And I started in 2003. I started Chintu. And when it was, The First Woman was rejected, I rewrote it, sent it out in 2005. It was rejected. Meanwhile, I was writing Chintu. I think I gave up in 2008 after that rejection. And then at that point, I thought, okay, you need to earn a living. So I decided I'm going to do a PhD and start, lecturing. That wasn't very successful either, because at the same time, I was working and paying my fees because I didn't have funding. So it was really a very stupid decision I took without understanding what Britain or what immigration was like. But by the time I finished the second book, Chintu, I had decided that I am going to be poor and therefore I'm going to write exactly what pleases me, because they had rejected the book that I thought was working. So I wrote into the way it is, and it was rejected. And I was mad enough to start a third book. You know, what else would I do? I was going to be a serious student, applying for visa, renewing visa, and writing and studying and writing. It was really crazy. But then something just happened when the late Binyavanga came up with this brilliant idea of a manuscript project. Because he said that for African authors, even being published is like winning an award, you know. So why should we give awards to people who have already won awards, you know, by being published? So let's have an award for people who are not published. So the first time I heard it was late. You know, I found out that I should have submitted that day by midnight. So I gave it up. And then a day later, they were like, yeah, we've extended it. And I sent my manuscript of Chintu, and it won the manuscript project. And guess, one of the awards was Ella Wakatama. I know. Ella has literally, sometimes I think Ella Wakatama has lifted African literature in her hands from a certain point, probably from the noughties, but I suspect she had a hand in Ben O'Cree's The Famished Road as well. Yeah. This girl has just done it for African literature. But at that point, I was already aware who she was. So when I was told that she was going to edit my book, I was in Tesco's and I screamed the aisles down. You know how you scroll down your phone? And I was with my partner and he said, he said, you've won another award. I said, yeah. How much? Absolutely, because that is all he thinks about, you know, in terms of money. I said, the best editor in the world. And I was so lucky Ella nurtured this book in such a way that even when it traveled to Europe, because it came out in Africa in 2014, but it was rejected in Britain and in America for a very long time. But when they finally accepted to take it on, they would not change a single word. You know, everybody read it and said, I dare not. One editor rejected it and said, it's a wonderful book. I would like to change it, but I dare not. You know, that's what Ella did to that book. And in a way, after people had read Chintu, publishers decided this is the way she is. We're not going to change her, you know. So now, even though I don't get edited by Ella, I get edited by another Zimbabwean, Vimbai Shire. They work together with Ella, and she also worked on Chintu. So when I didn't get Ella, I got Vimbai, and Vimbai applied the same principle to my writing. And so every book I write, it goes via those the Vimbai before it goes to the European publisher. And Vimbai says, if they say this, don't agree. With this one, you can give in a little bit, but otherwise, do not agree. And that has shaped my writing in such a way that, you know, when Chintu came out the first time in America and it got a starred review, I swear to you, I got 4 publishers writing to me the next day asking for the book, including One World, who publishes me. And all 4 had rejected this book. And I remember after it came out and my publisher was really happy with what was happening, she took me off to a meal and said, Jennifer, this is sad we didn't hear about it. You know, we've heard that you've been rejected over and over. This is sad. You know, being me, I said, well, you rejected it too. And she sat back like, no. I said, I'll send the email. Because I'd saved them. Difficult offer. However, after Chintu, I didn't have problems with the next two books. So in a way, Chintu paved the way. So the short stories worked very well because there was this sense, oh, now she's writing about Europe. This will make more sense. It's not as African. So it will also get her more other readers who wouldn't get into Chintu. And when it comes to the first woman, it was you know, the publishers just took it on. In fact, in America, I had a choice. You cannot believe this, Tsitsi. Like I had 4 publishers buying for my book. And I was like, nah, that one, no. It was wonderful after I'd been rejected. You know, I was so evil. But at the same time, I had then learned what to look for in a publisher. So I had a publisher who was giving me a lot of money. But I asked, how are you going to promote it? You know, so for me, I went with a middling publisher who treated my book like this was the best thing to happen to them, rather than the large publisher who had a lot of big names where my book would be, you know, one of those, you know. And so I haven't regretted it. But this is after like 16 years of rejection, you know. Now the world is opening up to me, you know.
And I mean, I remember that time, you know, Jennifer, because we knew each other then, you know,
Yes.
when I had read, you know, Chintu, not in the right order, but in individual books. And I just couldn't believe that, you know, you kept getting rejections. I just couldn't believe it. I thought it was just a work of genius. But you kept going. And sometimes, I mean, I just felt heartbroken, you know, that this book wasn't making it through. And then when that's finally published and kind of going from success to success, it just feels so good, yeah, that this is finally happening, and that it is becoming easier. But it's been a massive struggle, hasn't it? I mean, it
has been a massive. It's been a massive struggle, and in a way, Tsitsi, I'll say, I'm glad for that struggle. As an author, I have grown. I've learned not to take anything for granted. It has made me humble. Had I been successful earlier on when I first arrived in Britain, I don't know what kind of person I would be or what kind of author I would be. But now I understand the publishing world because I've been able to stand outside and watch everything, you know. So I'm happy that happened. It was painful, really painful, but I'm happy that it happened. And in a way, Tsitsi, I've wondered, because, you know, while I took 20 years to get published, you took almost 30 years between the 3 novels. And when I was reading The Mournable Body, I kept on asking myself, would Tsitsi have written this book this way had she quickly finished the A Nervous Condition, then, you know, 3 years later, Book of Note, 3 years later, A Mournable Body? Would you still have written it like this? Because I felt that those 30 years allowed you to stay with Tambu for a very, very long time. And I started to see the bitterness, which absolutely made sense, and which relates very beautifully to what is slowly happening to Zimbabwe.
Yes, Jennifer, that's the perspective that I think it's important to take. 1980s Zimbabwe was booming. 1990s, it was like at the turn of the millennium that things started to go wrong in Zimbabwe. And so if I had had quick successes with novels, I'd certainly have been another kind of writer. And I think that writing necessarily, anything that comes out of the person reflects the person. So writing necessarily reflects the person. So that means I would have been another kind of person. Having said that, I believe that everybody has their challenges in life, and I'm not one to want to think that this weight of challenges is weightier than that load of challenges. So it would have been different, but I am happy with where I am. I'm happy with my perspective on life. I think that's actually important, because I think the professional classes in Zimbabwe who became successful in the 1980s and 1990s did not understand what was happening. Not in the state, in the political sense, but in the nation as a place where people have to live. A nation which has to provide an environment that enables people to sustain their lives, because we had no experience of it. How were we to know how it all functioned and what dysfunction in a nation looked like and what dysfunction could do? And we were also coming out of the extended family system where dysfunction could be contained to some extent. So we didn't have a clue. We just did not have an idea. By the time people started waking up to it, at the beginning of this millennium in the noughties, the damage had been done. So the universe conspired to make sure that I was not one of those people. You know, there was no way that I could become comfortable and complacent because of the trajectory that my life took. When writing didn't work for me, I packed up and I went to Germany to study film, left everything, had nothing, bought a one-way ticket. In fact, I had a ticket that went as far as England, as far as I remember. It was something like this. Oh no, I bought the ticket, but I had a stopover in Kent at a conference where they reimbursed me my tickets. So I said to them, look, there's a little bit extra, which is on to Berlin. Would you mind paying for that too? So they said, oh, it's okay, it's your ticket. So that is the money I arrived with in Germany.
And I thought I was crazy.
Unlike you, I went back a failure. So I had that experience too. That was in 2000, after I'd gone to Germany in 1989. Didn't work there anywhere. Very similar things, but now in film, and also working in a language that I had no mastery of. Oh, yes. And so I'll blame it on my children. I'll say I wanted my children to have a Zimbabwean experience. So I went back a failure. And yeah, that was formative as well.
I didn't realize how similar our experiences are.
You know, so when you were talking about you don't go back to Uganda or any African country really as a failure, I just wanted to die laughing here. I mean, that is really one of the issues on the continent, because we then tend to mythologize our experience across the waters, you know, and they come back in this mythologized form, you know, along with the packages from Woolworths.
I know.
Oh dear. So it's something that really struck me as well. I think talking about being on and off continents as well. But I think what was fascinating, I think for both of you, you were talking about really that so much of the success at the beginning, and also thinking about Ella being that common connection, that it's still, even though sort of North America and Europe are kind of like the sort of the gatekeepers, the barriers to success, in many ways, it seemed as if it's within the continent that you've actually had that support. I mean, like Jennifer, you're saying about, you know, with winning the Kwani Prize. It was I remember that happening. It was such a huge thing, and then also the fact that, I mean, not to go on about this easy, but I think because, you know, like Jennifer said, I think we're also just a bit dumbfounded about the fact that, you know, you can publish a novel like Nervous Conditions and that's still not sort of provide the clout off the continent or even within the continent by the sound of it to kind of get that publishing momentum. So yeah, I was kind of like wondering then what, you know, it's tricky, isn't it? Because you kind of had to have that support within the continent in order to have success off the continent. So, you know, how, you know, where do you feel like your writing or kind of your published works kind of fit or are going to be located within like the African continent, and if they don't, perhaps speak to that as well about, you know, the differences in terms of readership and accessibility, which I know is something that you're both you know, very, you know, think very deeply about.
This word gatekeepers is really laden. And I really do not know how to engage with it, because if I look at things from the point of view of industry, which is to make profit, I can have a completely different perspective on it. Just recently, somebody read This Mournable Body and wrote to me and said, Tsitsi, I love this book. I love it so much. I've given it to my best friend to read because I think everybody should read it. And I have instructed her to pass it on when she is done with it, which is wonderful. But from the point of view of making profit, which also means from the point of view of my earning a living, it's not going to work. So I'm not an industry insider, and living on the continent, I really don't know how the industry is structured. And I'm more familiar with the film industry from that point of view. But I can understand the imperatives. So what I would like to see more of are professional activities and initiatives to enable the industry to function better on the continent. If we look at the late Binyawanga, how long did that initiative of his go on for, Jennifer? Do you remember? It was about 3 years, right?
Yes. Kwani as a trust lasted over 10 years, but it lasted on the goodwill of the West. As soon as the West took away all the support, it came crashing to the ground.
This is what I mean. I do not see the intentions that lead to a sustainable production and distribution system. There are people on the continent now who have money. We see it. There is a lot of money, and there are more readers on the continent. You know, so there are people who are promoting literature at very high levels on the continent, but the industry cannot keep track. There are historical antecedents to this, of course, because we had those literature bureaus that were a legacy of empire that only allowed local populations to produce certain very small narratives that were embedded in what they called tradition. Although we all know that tradition is not written down and formulated and codified because it's dynamic, but something else happened in my part of the world in that it was then written down as law. And, you know, things like witchcraft were codified. You cannot do X, Y, Z. But then the literature was encouraged to engage with those kind of codified experiences and practices. You know, so people were kept in a certain kind of mental cocoon. And that was done on purpose to produce a certain kind of person. So we are still engaging with the legacy of those kinds of systems. I am grateful for any of the initiatives that enable people like Jennifer to be published, you know, even if the publishing aspect of it only lasts for a few years, that is part of the process.
Yeah.
But I do think it's important for me to speak out and say we have to keep investing in the process so that it produces more sustainably. But then it's not really up to the West to be the first mover, I think, in that practice. We have immensely wealthy people on the continent.
Yeah. Yeah.
You stand, if you are fortunate enough to meet one and stand and have a conversation eye to eye, you will start mentioning narrative and you will see the eyes of many glazing over. And it is very difficult to persuade them of the inherent value of narrative, which ends up producing everything else that we see. You know, the idea that I can split an atom comes from a culture where things are possible, and the possibility of things is portrayed in the way we talk about them. You know, so our people who are wealthy and could invest in ways of thought that make life possible on the continent do not do it. You know, they prefer to donate to wealthy colleges in the West or to rebuild cathedrals that burn down in the West. That's where they want to put their money. And so I really think actually it's up to us, the practitioners, to find a way of engaging, because I find that the notion of gatekeepers, it may be real in the sense that there are people who have certain priorities which may not dovetail with mine, but it just diverts my energy into that dead end, into that cul-de-sac, whereas my energy should be growing, it should be flourishing, it should be mushrooming, and it should be nurturing other things as well. So I'm trying to change my thinking now to find out how this energy that we have as practitioners can actually make something happen on the continent.
Jennifer, do you want to add to that?
Yes, that is, Tsitsi almost touched everything that is going on the continent in terms of production and distribution. Perhaps Nigeria is doing better. They are, I think, because they've had these large institutions like Wole Soyinka, Chinua Achebe, and therefore they've been able to start moving the wealth and channeling it a little bit towards literature. So Nigeria, in a way, is doing a lot better than the rest of Africa. And of course, that reflects in the kind of literature and writing that is coming out of that place, because it's of such a high caliber. What I've noticed is that Western publishers are now picking up on the readership in Africa. So there are now agents that supply African bookshops, you know, that are aware of where the markets are. So they will go, any African novel that is published, they'll first take it to Nigeria, you know, because they know they're going to make a lot of money from Nigeria. But in a way now for me, because my publisher was quite early on told that I write, my audience is specifically Ugandan and African, East African and African. There's a way that now she allows me, even though I'm not going to sell a lot of copies in East Africa, but she allows me, if it's possible, to launch my book first in Uganda. There's a sense now that in Uganda that, okay, Makumbi is putting out a book, this is exciting. It's beginning to pick up now for me, and I'm quite, even though I'm not there, which is of course unfortunate, but it's picking up around East Africa, in Kenya and in Rwanda. So, but the problem is that all the books that come from Britain are exorbitantly expensive. A lot of people do say that, yeah, we love your books, but they are expensive. So it's not surprising to find three girls coming to sign books, and the three of them, each one buys Chint, one buys the short stories, and one buys the first woman, and they say, sign all three to all of us. We're going to swap. Because you see, they have to come to find ways of getting access to the novels within the limited resources that they have. And so therefore, the readership we are now accessing are mainly the middle classes, those who have access to the publishing axis of London, New York, Melbourne, and those rich people. But a lot of initiatives to publish start and then fail. You're always hearing somebody starting something and then it fails because, one, if they, in a way, African readers, we were primed to read the West. Colonization primed us to read the West. So a lot of people are still reading a lot of Western novels. But still, they will read you when your book has come through the empire and back to them. So there are a lot of books being published on the continent, but they don't travel around the continent as well. So the writer himself or herself will push the books because the distribution is not good, and also the publicity is almost absent. And so, as it is said, until the rich people start to do what happened in the West and become patrons of writing, of publishing, of awards, we're still going to rely heavily on the West. And now that the West is finding out the market in Africa, they're going to be more efficient on distributing books from the West and take up the market for the books that are published in Africa. And so it's an unfair competition. And this is the reason a lot of people ask, why do writers travel to the West? African writers travel to the West. We're aware of what is going on. Do you know what I mean? So the readership is there. There's no doubt about it. But if only my publisher would find a way of producing my books on the continent, so that they are cheaper there, or they get produced in India and be flown to Africa, they'll still be cheaper than when they are produced by Penguin here, but these are ways that perhaps as authors, we should get together, African authors, and sit down and think about things. And I think the problem with immigration is that we are so scattered and we are not in touch with each other. But I suspect that if the authors themselves got together, and we would come up with something.
I agree with you. May I? Yeah, I agree with you, Jennifer. when writing took off, literature took off, well, put it this way, when literature in the English language took off on the continent in the 1950s and 60s, there were very few people who were the recognized writers.
Yeah.
And they could meet. They could travel from one university to another, maybe 20, 30 people. They were in touch. They could read each other's manuscripts. But now the situation is so different. There are so many people writing amazing literature from the continent. And as you say, we are scattered and we have no focal point. Actually, in that time, up until political decolonization and independence in the 1960s, the focal point for the writing was, in fact, England. So people would meet like at Makerere or wherever else they met, but it was always in the orbit of London. Yes. And so now we have no center. You know, there is no place that is recognized as the place where African writers meet to talk on the continent. There are a couple of festivals that have tried, but it hasn't worked. The history of book festivals on the continent, it's really tragic. And the reasons why festivals fail, mismanagement, misappropriation of funds, political interference, and plain jealousy. You know, this group of people here will start a movement that undermines something else. And unfortunately, still that link to empire, former empire, is functional in that those who have closer ties are better able to come into the to come into resources. Let me put it that way.
Yes.
So we are still living in coloniality in literature, very definitely in the shadow of empire. But there again, as I think we are agreeing, Jennifer, it is up to the people who are able to make the necessary changes. A lot of the money that comes onto the continent for non-governmental, independent literary activities, production, distribution, whatever it may be, comes from philanthropists of the continent, wealthy individual people who think, I would like to do this for African literature.
Yes.
Where Africans cannot do that for themselves. Right now, the AU is organizing a book prize because this is the year of art and culture, I believe, 2021. Will it be a one-off thing so that whoever is doing it now can wear that as a badge? Oh, I did the book prize in 2021. Or are we actually thinking sustainably about creative industries? You know, so these are the questions where we do not have a place where we can gather to talk and to make recommendations and even take resolutions. You know, and looking at the trajectories that we have, it's very difficult for a writer who knows that they've got a story to tell, who is struggling to publish, to get on a plane and come, let's say, to Cape Town. That's where I am now. You know, how do you do that? It's very difficult for me, actually, from Zimbabwe, Jennifer, to get hold of your books. Because unless I am invited to a literary event somewhere in the world where I can afford to pay the price of the books, which up until this Mournable Body was not part of the equation, you know, I wasn't going to buy the books. Yeah, I would look at them longingly and maybe just buy one or two, but not enough for me to say that I am well read in African literature as an African writer myself. And that's me. So how much more so other people? So we need to do some serious thinking about how we can introduce some organization that is agreed upon, where people by consensus say, yes, we can have this as a focal point. You know, even if we agree, maybe we need different focal points because the history of sub-Saharan Africa is very different from the history of West Africa, you know, but we need some consensus on how it's going to function. Otherwise, it's not going to function according to the way we want it to.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally get you. And meanwhile, we keep on building knowledge in the West, which does not travel back to the worlds where we come from.
Yeah, you see, we don't have that society where people from different sectors come together. You know, we don't have this event where wealthy business people engage with people who are well respected in the arts or who are well respected in research. We are all in our silos, and our silos are tilted towards the West. That is the situation we have at the moment. And I don't see the vision for that to change. I see at the levels where power is wielded that people would like to keep it that way because it's manageable. So I really feel it is up to us, the practitioners, to keep on. And they will listen. You spoke about Nigeria. People are beginning to understand in Nigeria that we can only create nation insofar as we create people who can create nation. And that is the kind of work that we do.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you both so much. You know, I mean, I feel like this could go on, and this is such an important discussion to be had. And I know the sort of South Asian context better, which is quite a different one. And I must say, I find it's really hard to listen to how difficult it is, you know, to get your you know, world-class books, you know, out there and to be read. But so for this part of the conversation, you know, thank you both so much. You know, this has just been it just felt like a really important conversation that need to happen more and more often, yeah, in all kinds of contexts. So thank you both so much, and we hope that we can continue this discussion with even a wider audience, you know, when we meet next. But and Amy had to leave. But so thank you both so much. Thank you also, Josh, you know, for always being there in the background and making everything just kind of work incredibly smoothly. So thank you both so much. It's been a real privilege. So yeah, and a real pleasure seeing you both. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you, Josh. Thank you so much, Jennifer. I've just had such a wonderful time talking to you. Thank you.
Same here. Thank you, Nicole. Hi, Josh. And lovely to talk to you, Tsitsi. I hope we see each other soon somewhere in Ake or wherever we normally meet. And I hope my books will be brought to South Africa. I've been told in South Africa they're not available either. So.
And thank you for your message last November. Thank you.
Okay. Welcome. Yes.
Welcome back. Thank you, Tsitsi and Jennifer, for coming back. And it seemed, even though it was only less than 2 weeks since we last met, so much has happened. So we want to all congratulate Tsitsi Dangarembga for winning the Pen Award. Well, that was a fantastic one. Yay, brilliant.
Yay, amazing. Yes. Very well deserved.
Congratulations. Do you just want to briefly say something about that? How big a deal is it?
Pardon?
How big a deal is it?
Oh, it's a big deal. I've been writing for so long, and now the recognition is coming in. It's a big relief. Let me put it that way. You know, I've been feeling as though I've been writing into the void for decades. Because people enjoyed reading Nervous Conditions, but as I said in our previous talk, I didn't get much out of it. It was just being glad that people were touched by the book, but it didn't really change my life in material ways. And I didn't get that kind of recognition for it either. So I'm delighted to finally have it.
Oh, fantastic. Oh, that's wonderful. And so just to the audience, you know, we are live for another just under 15 minutes. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and ask them. You can use the live chat, and as I'm pointing towards my live chat, and or you can use the PSC email address, which is also in the live chat. But just for now, while we still have you, and there are no questions sort of in the pipeline, we were just wondering whether you would like to talk about your current projects, book projects, film projects. Who would like to go first?
Yeah, I will. Yes, I am writing a couple more books at the moment, one adult and one young adult. And they both reflect maybe the political status quo in Zimbabwe, which really is the political situation in most of the continent, but also in the world. America has escaped, but up until recently, it was in a very similar situation. I believe the UK is in a similar situation, various countries in Europe. So it's actually a young adult. One of them is a young adult. And I felt that nobody really explains how power operates to affect young people. On the continent, and young people really don't have a grasp of it. They understand power as political parties, and so you join a political party to have power, but they don't really understand the connection with day-to-day life. And so that was one of the themes that I'm exploring actually in both the adult and the young adult. Well, I've been writing feature films for possibly 4 decades as well. And so now the industry is opening up to women of color, not so much from the continent at the moment. Women of color tend to be able to make films when they're off the continent, but I'm still working to get that access to the industry for women on the continent who are outside South Africa or perhaps Kenya or Nigeria, which are the countries that are being brought into the global film economy at the moment. So it's really weird because I might have a script that I started writing in 2000 that I then repurposed for 2021. But I can't put it down because it's something I really want to say. So I have a whole range of scripts on a whole range of topics, including, a love story. I'm so pleased with myself finally writing a love story.
Fantastic. I can't quite picture that. What about you, Jennifer? What's your current project, or how much do you want to give away about your current project?
Well, I just copy whatever Tsitsi does.
Oh.
So I'm also working on 2 projects, one for young readers and one for adults. But the one for young readers is mainly loosely based on some of the folk tales that I grew up with, and it came out of 2 reasons. Once I saw Moana, that made it big in the US, I thought, okay, maybe the West is now getting tired of redoing Cinderella and Rapunzel and whatever, and they might be looking outside the West for oral stories, or rather folk tales. So I started writing it with that in mind. So it started as a script, but then one time I went home to Uganda, took a book from my best friend, and her daughter told me, "Oh, you give mom books. Who doesn't read? But you don't bring me any books." And I said, "Well, I don't write for children." And she said, "Why?" And I said, I don't know how to write for children. And Titi, you've never seen contempt in a child's eyes. Like, how can you be able to write for grown-ups but cannot write for children? Like, she looked at me like, I thought you were intelligent. So I returned and changed what I had been writing for a script and turned it into a story. So I'm waiting to go to Uganda and show it to her and say, I did write a book for you, and it's almost finished. But it's one of those stories that comes from the stories that I grew up with. But as you know, with oral traditions, you have permission to change them and drop what is redundant and add what is useful now. So that's what I've done with that. The adult book is far miles away from that, because now I am moving away from focusing on Uganda and on Buganda with that, fine-tuned, intense focus. And I'm panning out and focusing on Africa and the idea of Africa. So the themes are mainly Pan-African, so that the Africa is no longer just the continent, but Africa is European Africa, is the Americas Africa, it's the Caribbean, it's the Persian Africa. When you search for Africa in the world, Africa is everywhere in the world. It's ridiculous. And I found that incredibly interesting. And I thought, okay, if this one was one world, how would we relate? And so that's what I'm dealing with. I know it's ambitious, and I know it's going to take me a long time if I finish it, but I intend to. So I've given myself something like 6 years to complete it. I don't know what it will be like, but that is all I can say about it.
I'm super excited by that, though, because I think I'm really pleased to hear. I mean, I know it's ambitious, but I think that's such an important idea. I mean, even something that I looked at in my first monograph was this idea about my argument being that that Africa is often positioned as kind of as marginalised on the global space, but actually I think contemporary novels in particular really show actually that it's really central, particularly to kind of post-Second World War global history and geopolitics. I'm so excited. I can't wait. I'm just so chuffed to hear you say that you're going to kind of tackle that bigger topic. I think that's going to be super exciting.
Yeah, I think after 3 books,
There's one question from one of our wonderful doctoral candidates, Alan Janji. He says, what can young and up-and-coming practitioners, academics of African backgrounds do to create that culture of reading instead of relying on the West?
Yeah, well, I don't quite understand the sense of the question as to whether the question asks what academics can do to encourage reading in other people, or what they can do in terms of their own writing, because I imagine academics write as well. So I think we have to write with our readers in mind. I think that's really important. For me, it's often a case of wanting to have a conversation with somebody about something. My young adult was inspired when I saw my son reading Percy Jackson. And I wanted to talk to him. He was at the age where talking to mothers was not cool. And so I started reading the book so I could talk to him. And then I thought it would be so much better if we could have something from our own cosmology, our own perspective on the universe to talk about in the same way. And so really it was a conversation with my son and wanting to communicate with him that started me thinking about YA. And I found that that is what works for me. Nervous Conditions was definitely a conversation with young Zimbabwean women to say, look, yes, go out there, the world is open for you, but be aware that there might be this challenge or that challenge to face. The Book of Not was definitely a conversation with Zimbabwe about racism. And This Mournable Body was a conversation with Zimbabweans about themselves. It was really important for me to say, hey, can we just put everything on hold and have a look at ourselves and see how we might think about doing things differently? So for me, the conversation aspect is very important.
Thank you.
I totally agree with you, Tsitsi. The idea that we should write with Africa in mind. And for me, that is key to what I do. I write indeed to have a conversation with Africans. Everybody else, you can join in, but this is mainly a conversation with Africans. And for a very long time, Africans thought that books that come out of Africa are mainly literature, very serious literature books, and if you want to relax, you have to go to Western books and read Dan Brown, or that African novels are mainly written for the West because we write about Africa in a way that is telling the West about ourselves, which of course most of African readers found incredibly boring because, you know, they know about themselves. So there was a need for us to turn around and start actually having a conversation rather than talking about our culture, whatever, just having a conversation about our culture. So what I've found is that, of course, Africans read, but what do they read? And what do they want to read? The other thing is that, and unbeknownst to most people, African novels are more expensive in Africa than Western novels are expensive.
Oh, Jennifer frozen.
Readers that are not that are working class. And so one of the things that we talked about and we thought about, Tsitsi, was how do we get our books, which are published in the West, to be published on the continent in a way that makes them accessible, so we can have that conversation with African readers. But for a person like you, who is a PhD student, if you're going to write about Africa and write about African novels, I find that it's very useful to be accessible. I've recently read an article about Uganda, where I come from, and it's talking about Uganda's political aspects. And it was written by 3 German people. And the language, which is English, is prohibitive, even to I, who has a PhD and supervises PhDs. And I thought, hang on a minute. These people are talking about us, but we have no idea what they're saying. But also so that we can intervene, we can join the conversation, we can correct, we can affirm. You know, it's that problem that when scholars write about Africa and they write in a way that Africa is not going to understand us, it turns us into objects. Yeah. You know, but we are subjects that produce knowledge and consume knowledge. So a student like you, if you're going to write about Uganda, if you're going to write about East Africa, if you're going to write about the rest of Africa, make sure your writing is accessible so that we can intervene in what you're saying about us.
Well, thank you. That was, I think, a brilliant concluding statement. Well, thank you so much, both of you. You know, Jennifer, Tsitsi, it's just been wonderful. It's been a real treat and privilege, and I just can't believe how lucky we are that we just managed to spend so much time with you. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you, everyone who's watching and who will be watching. And yes, thank you. And tomorrow is another day for the conference, a long day that starts early in the morning. So see you then.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for tuning in.